For some months now, I've been building this custom spaceship from scratch, but it's not finished yet. So today, we're making the engine room. I'm starting with this floor pan. I use styrene to fill out some of the areas to make it look less like the interior of a car and more like something I've actually made myself. When it comes to the actual engine, I use parts from a circuit board, bits from kits, and use custom cut styrene pieces. I tried to make use of some of the existing features from the floor pan to make the design look intentional. Because of the small surface area, I use baking soda with superglue to give it some extra strength. Of all the rooms I've made so far, this one has mostly been built on the go, with very little planning ahead. That's because I didn't really know how I wanted the room to look, but if I just make something that feels right, it usually ends up fitting my style and the rest of the ship. Does that make sense? I did, however, make sure to use the same gauge wires I've used in the other rooms of the ship. It's like poetry, they rhyme. As you can see, it's way too small for the room, so I start thinking that maybe what I just made is actually the hyperdrive. So I move on to making the main engine, using this R2-D2 body part as a base to build on. I start by trimming it down to fit the room. Then I make a piece in Blender and 3D print it to fill out this open area. I also modeled and printed a custom keyboard and computer screen to fit into some of the areas originally meant for R2-D2's front vents, coin return and power coupler. And yes, I had to look that up. I then add more wires to keep with the aesthetic. It's like poetry, they rhyme. For rivets, I use hexagon-shaped glitter. I didn't design my 3D part perfectly, so I add some Tamiya putty and sand everything flush. And I made these hand wheels. Before we move on to painting, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest Patreons, Mike Barrett and Richie Fender. Thanks a lot for the support, guys. I really appreciate it. I've written down and used the same paints for priming all the rooms in this series, starting with a 50-50 mix of matte grey primer from Army Painter and charred brown from Vallejo. When that's dry, I go over everything with a grimy grey from AK. Then it's time to block in the first coats of color. I like using fairly diluted paints and prefer to build up with multiple coats where it's needed. I went for brown and yellowish colors to make the engine room look dirty and hot. Once the larger areas are blocked in, I move on to the smaller parts, like wires, panels, switches, and so on. Even slightly different colors still make a big difference, I think. Now I did something that I kind of regret. In my mind's eye, I thought it would look cool to have a glowing blue light coming from the core. That's very hard to do with a brush, so I used the airbrush. But I ended up with a lot of overspray that I then had to fix. It's not a big deal, but I think I could have saved a lot of time and maybe gotten a better result if I had done things in the right order. At this point, I'm color matching and blending the walls of the engine room with the rest of the ship. I like visual guides, so I decided to paint the engine room door red, as a kind of a warning to the crew. It was a 5-minute modification, but I liked the look of it. When lining up the engine room with the rest of the ship, it became clear just how narrow it is. You can barely see any of the details. So I had to pivot away from the perfectly straight cutaway and open this room up. I think showing the details is more important than sticking to the layout, and it also gives me more freedom later when I start working on the roof and hull in future videos. That's what you get for not planning ahead, I guess, but being flexible is also important. But it does require more priming and color matching, which takes time. Oh well. Now it's time for an enamel wash. Maybe you've seen me do this in previous episodes, but it's almost like a magic trick. It's fast and messy to apply, dab a bit off, and it only takes a few seconds. Where I like more grime, I just add more wash, and the less thinner I use, the grimier it gets. Once that's dry, it's starting to come together, but it still looks a bit flat. So next up is a dark pin wash. Tamiya panel liner is really fun to use. I'd be much more careful if I was working on a clean model, but in this particular case I don't mind if it bleeds out a bit or look a bit messy. After the pin wash is dry, it's time for highlights. This isn't my cleanest or most detailed paint job, but I'm not aiming for perfection, just an overall good impression. The computer screens are meant to show graphs and diagnostics of how the engine is performing in real time. I start by supergluing the printouts to the engine, then add UV resin on top to give the screens that retro computer look. One of my Patreon members suggested adding a toolbox, which is a great idea, so I modeled and printed this toolbox and some simple tools in Blender. I want any viewer of the diorama to clearly see the tools, so I build up the bottom of the toolbox with paper first, then place the tools on top. To fix everything in place, I use gravel and sand fixer, which works like a charm. After priming, I paint the tools first using a dark brown contrast paint, then the toolbox in a dark green contrast paint. When that's dry, I highlight the edges with a light green. Then add a subtle glaze on the top panels to give it some character. Finally, the tools get a gunmetal dry brush. The brown underneath makes them look worn and slightly rusty. Once the toolbox is finished, I glue it in place alongside a single wrench and these manuals to help the mechanics stay within approved engine limits. And with that, it's done. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you want to follow the progress of this project. In the next episode I'm going to make, well, I'm not really sure yet. So you should really subscribe to the channel, I guess. Until next time, goodbye.